The night the sheriff's lights washed across my fishing cabin, I genuinely thought they had taken a wrong turn, because nothing about the evening felt like the kind that ends with law enforcement walking across a muddy clearing toward the porch you built with your own hands. I had been sitting on the old cedar step with a mug of coffee going lukewarm beside me, listening to frogs and the gentle sound of water tapping against the rowboat tied to a stake at the bank, and I remember thinking the sky was about as close to perfect as it ever got out here. The cabin smelled like wood smoke and damp pine from the snowfall earlier in the week, and my biggest worry had been whether the perch fillets in the cooler were getting too warm because I'd forgotten to bury the ice deeper. Then the flashing lights bounced off the surface of the pond, rippling the reflection of the trees into jagged shapes, and for a second I honestly thought someone from the subdivision had just bought a new car with weird headlights, because the idea that those colors were meant for me felt ridiculous. But the sound of tires on the gravel track made everything very real very fast. The frogs went silent in that strange, synchronized way animals have when they know something is off, and a single dog barking from somewhere across the creek filled the space where my heartbeat suddenly became too loud. I stood up without really deciding to, wiping my hands on my jeans even though I'd only been sanding a patch of trim earlier and the dust had already brushed off. The cruiser turned into my clearing, slow and deliberate, headlights sweeping across the rough pine siding of the cabin and catching the dent in the metal roof where a branch fell last winter. It's a small place, barely more than a shed with a chimney, the kind of building nobody pays attention to unless they're trying to find fault with it. I built it over 2 summers with a mix of stubbornness and YouTube videos, and it always looked a bit crooked no matter how many times I re-leveled the porch, but it was mine. Or at least, I believed it was. The deputies got out, an older guy with a mustache and a younger woman with her hair pulled back so tightly I wondered if it hurt, and both had that composed, mildly cautious posture you see when they aren't expecting danger but know that people do stupid things in the woods. I raised a hand in greeting because that's what you do when you grew up being told never to make a cop guess your intentions. "Evening," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The older one nodded but didn't smile. "You the property owner?" he asked, and the way he said it made my stomach drop just a little. "Yeah," I said, "as far as I know." It came out half joking, half defensive, and I immediately wished I'd kept it simpler. The younger deputy glanced at the cabin, then down at a small notepad. "We got a call about an unauthorized structure on HOA land," she said, matter of fact. "Caller said you were trespassing and ignoring previous warnings." I blinked at her. "Ignoring what warnings? I've been here since 4. The only one I talked to today was a squirrel stealing bait from my tackle box." The older deputy looked past me toward the trees, as if expecting someone else to appear. "Anyone with you tonight?" "Just me," I said. "My truck's right there if you want to check." The only things making noise earlier were my handsaw and a very uncooperative hinge. They had me step toward the truck while they repositioned the cruiser, and the younger deputy radioed for the caller to be escorted up the road. That was when the knot in my stomach tightened, because I suddenly knew exactly who had dialed 911. When you share a loose boundary with an HOA, there is always one person who behaves like a border patrol agent armed with bylaws instead of common sense, and in this case her name was Karen Crawford. I didn't know her well, but I knew enough. She drove a white Lexus, wore the kind of athletic clothes that never seemed to get dirty, and had once stopped in the middle of the road to lecture me about runoff issues, because my truck tires had splashed through a puddle near their walking path. We'd spoken twice, both times initiated by her, and both times about something she believed I was doing wrong. So when the headlights of a white SUV appeared at the end of my track, moving with the confidence of someone convinced they were arriving to solve a problem others had failed to address, I already felt the beginning of a headache forming behind my eyes. The Lexus rolled to a stop, and Karen stepped out holding a clipboard like it was a badge. She gave me a glance sharp enough to cut drywall before turning her full attention to the deputies. "Officers, thank you," she said, ignoring my existence entirely. "The structure is on HOA common property. It violates our land use restrictions and must be removed immediately. I have printed documentation. She handed over a sheet with highlighted sections and neat arrows drawn in red pen. The older deputy looked it over quietly and asked for my deed. I retrieved the blue folder from inside the cabin, the one holding every land-related paper I'd ever received, most of them creased and worn from being handled too many times. I handed it to him and watched his eyes shift between the documents, his brow tightening with each pass. The air felt heavy, full of wood smoke, wet soil, and that tense quiet that settles when too many people are waiting for one person to speak. Finally, he exhaled and said, "We've got a discrepancy." The word hit harder than I expected. He held both documents side by side. "Your deed says your parcel stops at the old fence line. The HOA plat says their common lot extends past it. And your cabin is sitting right in the middle of the overlap." I stared at the overlapping lines, suddenly aware of how small my cabin truly was in the context of paperwork and subdivisions and people with clipboards. Karen folded her arms triumphantly. The younger deputy gave me a sympathetic but unreadable look. And all I could think, standing there between the trees and the cruiser and the pond that had felt like home, was a slow, sinking realization that this wasn't a misunderstanding I'd fix with a single conversation. This was going to turn into something bigger, something messier, something that might determine whether I'd built a peaceful getaway or an accidental trespass on a piece of land someone else believed she controlled, and the weight of that possibility settled over me heavier than the cold night air. The next morning started earlier than I wanted, mostly because I barely slept after the deputies left. They hadn't ordered me to leave the cabin, but they'd advised me, politely, almost apologetically, that it might be best to avoid making any further improvements until the property dispute was reviewed. That phrasing stuck with me, the way official language often does when it feels like it's hinting at something bigger. I had lain awake on the old cot, listening to the faint crackling of the wood stove and the distant sound of a car door slamming somewhere across the creek, replaying the conversation in my head and trying to remember every detail from the day I bought the land. By sunrise my head was crowded with possibilities I didn't like. The air inside the cabin felt stale, so I stepped outside with a mug of coffee and stood on the porch, watching steam rise from the roof as the sun warmed the frost. The pond looked eerily calm, a sheet of glass reflecting the trees with almost perfect clarity, and for a moment I wished I could just slip the rowboat into the water and pretend none of this was happening. But reality intruded in the form of a white SUV rolling to a stop at the end of the clearing. Karen got out, wearing the same expression she'd had the night before, something between righteous annoyance and smug certainty, only this time she carried a manila envelope instead of a clipboard. She didn't ask if she could come closer. She just started walking. "We need to talk," she said, tone clipped, as if she were addressing an employee who'd failed to follow instructions. I took a slow sip of coffee to buy myself a second of patience. "Morning to you too," I said. She ignored the comment. "I've brought documentation from the HOA attorney." She handed me the envelope and crossed her arms, feet planted as if preparing for a debate she fully expected to win. I opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, printed on thick paper with a watermark, stating that the structure, my cabin, was in violation of HOA property rights, and demanding immediate cessation of occupancy pending review. There was also a color-coded map, showing the boundaries of the subdivision and a highlighted section labeled HOA Common Parcel 14B. My cabin sat neatly in the center of that highlight like a bullseye. I felt a strange mix of irritation and disbelief as I looked at it. "This doesn't make sense," I said quietly. "My deed says my parcel includes this clearing." "Your deed is outdated," she replied immediately, without hesitation. The HOA updated the map when the walking trail was expanded. The land was redefined. That sentence made me pause. Redefined by who? "The board," she said, chin lifting slightly. "These decisions are made collectively. You should have been aware of the changes." I stared at her. I don't live in your subdivision. How would I know what your board decides? She pressed her lips together, clearly not accustomed to anyone challenging the logic of HOA governance. All landowners bordering HOA property receive notice. I didn't. Well, she said, shrugging in a way that transferred responsibility onto me without directly saying it, perhaps it was misplaced. The ease with which she dismissed the possibility of error would have been impressive if it hadn't been so infuriating. I folded the letter and map back into the envelope and held it loosely by my side. Look, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, I'm not trying to start a war. But I bought this parcel legally, from a real estate agent who walked the boundaries with me. There was an old fence line. There was a survey stake. Nothing suggested this was HOA land. Your real estate agent misled you, she said, as if she were stating a basic fact. They do that sometimes. It's unfortunate, but it doesn't change the current boundaries. The confidence in her voice made me wonder if she truly believed what she was saying or if she was simply repeating something she'd convinced herself was true. Before I could respond, another car approached, a dusty black pickup I recognized immediately. It belonged to Roy, a retired land surveyor who lived off the county road about a mile away. He was the kind of neighbor who waved whenever he passed and occasionally stopped by to talk about fishing or weather patterns. He had a quiet steadiness to him, the sort of man who didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. He parked beside the Lexus and stepped out slowly, adjusting his cap. Heard there was some excitement last night, he said, giving Karen a polite nod before focusing on me. Mind if I take a look? Karen stiffened. This is an HOA matter, she said sharply. Roy raised an eyebrow. Ma'am, I don't live in your HOA. I just know this land better than anyone within 10 miles. She opened her mouth to argue but seemed to decide against it, perhaps realizing his experience outweighed any paperwork she'd brought. Roy walked the perimeter of my clearing, studying the tree line, inspecting the ground for old markers. I followed him, grateful for something to do besides stand in a tense standoff. After a few minutes he crouched near the spot where the clearing narrowed toward the creek. Here, he said, brushing away leaves. Buried just below the soil was a weathered wooden stake with faded orange paint. He tapped it with one finger. Survey marker from the county's 2008 assessment, he said. This marks the corner of your parcel. Karen walked over quickly, heels sinking slightly into the mud. That doesn't mean anything, she said. Markers shift. Trees fall. Boundaries move. Roy looked up at her with a patience so steady it almost felt like a reprimand. Markers don't move unless someone moves them, he said. And I doubt anyone dug this up, buried it again, and covered it in 12 years of forest debris just to confuse future homeowners. She flushed slightly, the first hint of uncertainty I'd seen from her. But she didn't step back. Regardless, she said, the HOA map supersedes older markers. Roy stood slowly. HOA maps aren't legal surveys, he said. They're internal documents. What matters is the county record. The conversation paused there, suspended in the cold morning air. Even the birds seemed to quiet down. Karen's eyes hardened, a flash of something defensive or fearful crossing her face. We'll see what the attorney says, she muttered, turning sharply and walking back to her SUV. She didn't slam the door, but she closed it with purposeful force before driving off. When she was gone, Roy let out a long breath. She's trouble, he said. Always has been. I nodded, feeling tension drain from my shoulders. What do I do now? He picked up the stake again, turning it in his hand. You need a current survey, he said. A real one. It'll cost you, but it's the only way to settle this. I looked back at the cabin. The rough pine siding, the uneven porch, the chimney still releasing a faint wisp of smoke, and felt a surge of protectiveness I hadn't expected. I'll do it, I said quietly. Roy nodded. Good. And in the meantime? Don't let her scare you off your own land. His words stayed with me long after he left, echoing in the clearing as I stood there with the envelope still in my hand, wondering just how far Karen was willing to push this, and how ready I needed to be when the real fight began. The surveyor I hired was a soft-spoken guy named Miles, the kind of person who seemed more comfortable around maps and measuring equipment than people, and I remember thinking that was exactly what I needed, someone with no emotional stake in this mess. He showed up 2 days after Roy's visit, wearing a faded work jacket and carrying a tripod that looked like it had survived 3 decades of rough terrain. The morning was damp and a little foggy, the kind of weather that makes sound travel strangely, and I could hear the distant hum of the main road even though it was nearly a mile away. I led him to the clearing and explained the situation as neutrally as possible, though I could feel irritation bleeding through the way it always does when you've repeated the same story too many times. He nodded along, occasionally humming thoughtfully or jotting something down, but mostly he just listened, which was a refreshing contrast to Karen's tendency to interrupt with confidence unburdened by facts. When he finally set up his equipment, the clearing felt unusually quiet, broken only by the clicking of the tripod legs and the distant drip of water from the trees. I stood back and let him work, watching him place markers, measure distance, enter numbers into a small handheld device, then walk the perimeter again with a level of focus that made me feel oddly hopeful. After nearly an hour he paused, pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, and said, "Well, the parcel you think you own and the parcel the HOA thinks you're on don't match. But that doesn't mean you're in the wrong." That small, cautious sentence was enough to lift some of the weight pressing on my chest, but before I could respond, the sound of tires crunching over gravel drifted through the trees. I didn't even need to look. I knew that sound now. Sure enough, the white Lexus pulled into the clearing like it belonged there, and Karen stepped out wearing an expression that made it clear she had not come to observe quietly. Today she had a different folder, thick with papers, and she held it like a shield. "I wasn't informed you'd be conducting work on HOA land," she said, addressing me in the clipped tone of someone correcting a child. "This survey cannot be recognized without HOA authorization." I could see Miles stiffen slightly, not in fear but irritation, like he'd dealt with this kind of personality before. "Ma'am," he said gently but firmly, "I'm a licensed surveyor hired to assess a parcel based on the county records. I don't answer to an HOA." Her eyes narrowed. "This is common property. You're trespassing." Miles didn't flinch. "Unless your HOA filed an updated plat with the county, and I can tell you right now they didn't, your map is an internal document. It doesn't override recorded boundaries." Karen's jaw tightened, and she exhaled sharply, the way someone does when they're trying to keep control of a conversation that's slipping. "I have spoken with our attorney," she said, flipping open her folder, "and he confirmed that the board has the right to designate shared spaces as they see fit." Miles gave her a patient but unimpressed look. "Shared spaces within HOA jurisdiction, yes. This clearing is not legally theirs to designate unless the county approved the boundary change." That sentence hung in the air for a long moment, like a weight suspended between them. Karen's expression hardened into something defensive and almost panicked, like she knew the footing of her argument was crumbling but wasn't ready to admit it. "We have maintained this area for years," she said, raising her voice slightly. "Our volunteers cleared the trail. We planted trees." "We, which doesn't grant ownership," Miles interrupted softly. "It just means you took care of land you assumed was yours." I stayed quiet, not wanting to escalate things, but it was impossible to ignore the way her hands tightened on the folder, knuckles whitening. She took a step closer, directing every ounce of her frustration toward me. "You should have disclosed your construction plans," she said. "A responsible neighbor would have consulted us." Something about that sentence flicked a switch in my brain. Not anger exactly, but a clarity I hadn't felt since the night the deputies showed up. "Karen," I said carefully, "I don't live in your neighborhood. I'm not part of your HOA. I don't owe you consultation on my own land." She blinked as if the concept genuinely didn't compute, then straightened. "We'll see what the board says," she replied, turning as if dismissal of the conversation ended it on her terms. But before she reached her SUV, another vehicle appeared at the edge of the clearing, a dark gray Subaru I didn't recognize. A woman stepped out, bundled in a long coat, holding a laptop bag. She walked with purpose but not aggression, and her expression was neutral in a way that made her seem more dangerous to Karen than any deputy. "You must be Mr. Holbrook," she said to me, extending her hand. "I'm attorney Jenna Cole. You left a message with our office." Relief washed through me. I had called around the previous morning, looking for someone who knew both property law and local zoning history. She was one of the few who called back. "I figured it was best to get ahead of this," I said. Karen's eyes went wide. "You hired a lawyer?" she demanded, almost incredulous. "Already?" Jenna turned to her with a polite but firm nod. "And you must be the HOA representative." "President," Karen corrected automatically, a little breathless. "Well," Jenna said, "I'd like to review the HOA's claim if you don't mind." What followed was one of the strangest standoffs I've ever witnessed. Not yelling, not dramatic, just two women exchanging paperwork under a canopy of trees while a confused surveyor stood beside his tripod like he'd wandered into a very boring wildlife documentary. Karen handed over her maps with the confidence of someone who believed the truth was self-evident. Jenna reviewed them, flipping pages slowly, then asked, "Has this map been filed with the county recorder?" Karen hesitated. "It doesn't need to be," she said finally. "It was approved internally." Jenna closed the folder calmly. "Then it has no legal standing." The color drained from Karen's face. "That's not true." "It is," Jenna replied. "HOA boundaries only matter within land the HOA legally owns. You can't expand common areas by vote unless the county approves the change and the affected property owners sign off. Which she gestured toward me, did not. Silence swept through the clearing as thoroughly as the fog had earlier. Karen swallowed hard, her eyes flicking from Jenna to Miles to me, as though trying to find an angle that would make this feel winnable again. "This isn't over," she said, voice tighter, weaker. The board, Jenna interrupted gently, "cannot override county law." Karen stood there for several long seconds, her confidence cracking visibly around the edges. Then without another word she pivoted sharply and walked back to her Lexus. The engine revved harder than necessary as she sped away, spraying gravel behind her. When she was gone, Miles exhaled. "I'll have the final report ready in 48 hours, he said. "From what I'm seeing, you're on your own land." Jenna nodded. "Get me the report as soon as it's done," she told him. Then she turned to me. "Prepare yourself," she said. "She's not the type to back down gracefully. But the law is on your side." I believed her, but as I stood there in the clearing, the morning fog beginning to burn off and the silence settling in again, I had the uneasy sense that this conflict was about to get much more complicated before it ended. The 48 hours waiting for Miles's official report felt longer than the 2 months it took me to build the cabin, partly because every hour seemed to bring a new reminder that Karen wasn't letting this go. The first came the morning after the survey, when I drove back from town with groceries and found a laminated notice zip-tied to one of the cabin's porch posts. It was printed in the same format I had seen on HOA mailers before, bold lettering, formal tone, but this one read "Immediate compliance required. Unauthorized structure pending removal." At the bottom, in small print, was Karen's name and her signature written with elaborate loops, as though she wanted her handwriting to project authority even from a distance. I stood there holding a bag of eggs and bread, reading the notice twice, then 3 times, feeling a mix of irritation and disbelief settle in my chest. There was no legal weight behind the paper, but it still felt invasive, like someone had walked into my living room without knocking. I tore it off, tossed it into the fire pit, and tried not to think too hard about what she might do next. But the next sign came only a few hours later, when I heard voices on the trail behind the cabin, Karen's unmistakable clipped tone mixed with a softer male voice I didn't recognize. I stepped quietly toward the back window, and saw her walking with a man holding a camera on a strap around his neck. He wore a reflective vest and carried a tablet, the kind used by insurance adjusters or building inspectors. They paused at the edge of the clearing, and the man raised his camera, snapping photos of the cabin, the chimney, the porch, even my firewood stack. I stepped outside before he could take any more. "Can I help you?" I called, keeping my voice steady even though my pulse quickened. The man lowered his camera, looking mildly uncomfortable. "I was asked to document this structure for code review," he said. Karen stepped in quickly. "This is an unapproved building within HOA land," she said, her voice crisp, almost rehearsed. "We need photographic evidence for the file." I walked closer, stopping a few feet away. "This isn't HOA land," I said plainly. "And you don't have permission to photograph my property." The man shifted awkwardly. "Ma'am said, ma'am doesn't own this land," I cut in, still calm but more pointed than I intended. Karen's eyebrows shot up, but I wasn't in the mood to cushion the truth. "The survey is being finalized," I continued. "Until then, I'm asking you to leave." The man looked at Karen, then back at me, then muttered something about misunderstandings and turned toward the trail. Karen stayed still for half a second longer, staring at me with an expression that wasn't anger exactly, but something sharper, like she felt personally wronged by the idea that I wouldn't simply accept her version of reality. Then she pivoted and followed the man, her steps stiff and deliberate, as though she were trying to hold onto her dignity by sheer force of posture. That should have been the end of it for the day, but around dusk a different sound filtered through the trees. The low hum of conversation, several voices overlapping. Curious and wary, I walked around the cabin and found 4 members of the HOA board standing at the edge of the clearing, dressed in outdoor jackets and holding clipboards. One wore a hat embroidered with the name of the subdivision, and another carried a rolled-up poster tube. Karen stood slightly ahead of them, her expression triumphant, as if reinforcements had finally arrived. "We're conducting a site walk," said a tall man with a gray beard who introduced himself as the board secretary, "to evaluate the extent of encroachment on our common parcel." I felt a wave of tired amusement wash through me. "You don't have jurisdiction here," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. "This is an active legal boundary review. Until the county says otherwise, this is my land." Karen's mouth opened, but the board secretary held up a hand. "We understand your position," he said calmly. "But until we see the survey results ourselves, we're obligated to review potential violations." Something about his even tone made it hard to respond harshly. He didn't seem hostile, more like someone following procedure without entirely believing it applied. The others dispersed slightly, looking at trees, scribbling notes, or gesturing at invisible lines in the dirt. Karen hovered near the secretary, whispering something animatedly, but he barely reacted. After a few minutes he approached me. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "we didn't know the map had changed. Karen brought the new one to the board earlier this week." I blinked at him. "Changed? By who?" He looked uncomfortable. "She redrew some boundaries based on her interpretation of trail maintenance records." I stared at him, unsure if I had heard correctly. "She redrew the map herself?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "Apparently she updated the common parcel outlines to include areas she believed had been maintained by the HOA. She presented it as clerical correction." I felt a mixture of frustration and something close to shock. Karen hadn't just misunderstood. She had taken it upon herself to adjust maps to fit her assumptions, then convinced herself they were official. The secretary sighed. "We'll wait for the survey," he said. "If the report says you're on your land, this goes away." Before I could respond, Karen marched over, her voice sharp with indignation. "We are not conceding," she declared. "The board has every right to, Karen," the secretary said firmly. "We're going to wait for the report." She stopped mid-sentence, visibly startled by being contradicted, and for a moment her face softened into something almost vulnerable, confusion layered with embarrassment. But the moment faded quickly, replaced by a brittle stiffness. "Fine," she said. "But when the results come back, he needs to be ready to accept responsibility." The board left soon after, walking down the trail in a cluster of murmured conversation. Karen lingered at the clearing's edge, arms crossed, expression unreadable. For a moment I wondered what this was really about for her. Control, insecurity, the need to be right, or maybe something deeper she'd never admit. She looked at the cabin, at the porch I'd built by hand, at the chimney releasing a thin thread of smoke, and I could almost see the story she had built in her mind. An outsider intruding on her community, a rule breaker who needed to be managed. Without a word she turned and followed the board down the trail, leaving the clearing quieter than before. That night I sat by the stove, listening to the fire crackle and watching shadows move across the walls, thinking about how odd it was that a simple fishing cabin could trigger this kind of storm. The survey would come soon. The truth would settle things. But as I lay down on the cot, staring at the dark ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't preparing to accept whatever the report said, she was preparing to challenge it. The survey report arrived on a cold Wednesday morning, delivered not by email as I expected but in person by Miles himself, who stepped out of his truck with a manila envelope tucked under his arm and a tired but satisfied look on his face. I had been splitting firewood behind the cabin, trying to burn off the anxiety that had built up over the last 2 days, and when I saw him walking toward me through the thin mist rising from the ground, I felt a knot in my chest tighten and loosen at the same time. "Got your results," he said simply, handing me the envelope. His tone already told me everything I needed to know, but I still opened it carefully, scanning the printed pages, the maps, the measurements, the little red XS marking the true corners of the parcel. My name was listed next to the county's recorded boundary. The cabin sat entirely within it. A breath I didn't realize I'd been holding escaped as a shaky laugh. "So it's mine," I said. Miles nodded. "Every inch of it." Relief washed over me, but it lasted only a few seconds before reality caught up. Karen wasn't going to accept this quietly. As if summoned by my thoughts, the crunch of footsteps echoed from the trail. I turned to see the white Lexus pulling into the clearing again, stopping with its front tires just touching the edge of the mud line. Karen climbed out with the rigid posture of someone stepping into a courtroom rather than a forest. And this time she wasn't alone. With her was a man in a charcoal gray suit carrying a leather briefcase, the HOA attorney, presumably. He surveyed the clearing with mild annoyance, as if the outdoors itself offended him. Karen wasted no time. "Well," she demanded, striding toward us, "is the structure being removed or not?" There was something brittle in her voice, something stretched thin by waiting and worry, but she covered it with the determination of someone convinced they were moments away from vindication. I held up the survey packet. "The structure is on my land," I said calmly. "Every boundary matches the county record. This is the official survey." She froze only a second, but it was enough to see the flicker of uncertainty cross her face before she masked it with indignation. "Let me see that." The lawyer stepped forward before I could respond. "If you don't mind," he said, extending a hand with the professional politeness of someone who expected cooperation. I gave him the packet. He looked through the documents quietly, lips tightening as he reached the map with the red markers. After a long moment he exhaled through his nose in a slow, controlled way. "This aligns with the county assessor's file," he said. "Your plat revision wasn't filed, Karen." I watched her face change, not dramatically, but subtly, like a crack forming in a sheet of glass. She looked from the attorney to Miles to me, struggling to reconcile what she'd believed with what she was hearing. "That can't be right," she said softly, voice catching. "I measured it. The trail maintenance logs show." "Logs aren't legal documents," the attorney interrupted gently but firmly. "County surveys are." She blinked rapidly, jaw clenching, breath coming unevenly. And for the first time, she didn't look angry. She looked scared. Not of me, not of the cabin, but of being wrong, publicly, undeniably wrong, in front of the attorney she had brought to reinforce her certainty. There must be some mistake, she whispered. The board saw the map. The attorney closed the packet and handed it back to me. The board wasn't given the full context, he said. You presented the updated boundaries as official. Because they should be, she snapped, frustration cutting through the tremor in her voice. We take care of this land. We maintain the trails. We pick up garbage from people trespassing down here. She gestured vaguely in my direction. I thought, she stopped, swallowing hard. For a moment she looked down at her shoes, breathing carefully, like someone trying not to lose control of something fragile inside. When she spoke again, her tone was quieter, edged less with authority and more with exhaustion. I thought we were just restoring the parcel lines to what they used to be. The old board said this area belonged to the HOA before the last subdivision expansion. The attorney's face softened slightly. Karen, that was never recorded legally. Old assumptions don't carry weight in property law. She stared at him, shoulders curling inward almost imperceptibly. The fight drained out of her posture, leaving something smaller, something closer to hurt than hostility. It was strange seeing her like that, someone who had spent weeks projecting unwavering certainty now confronting the truth she'd pushed aside. For a moment I felt an unexpected twinge of sympathy. It passed quickly, but it was real. She took a step back, pressing a hand to her forehead. I didn't mean to escalate this, she murmured. I thought someone was building on our land without permission. I thought I was doing the right thing. The attorney sighed quietly. Your intentions don't change the facts, he said. But they may help the board understand what happened. Karen looked at me then, really looked, not with the suspicion or judgment she'd directed at me for weeks, but with something closer to apology, though not quite willing to be spoken aloud. I didn't want a conflict, she said. I just wanted to protect the community. I get that, I said honestly. But you could have talked to me first. A tight, embarrassed smile flickered across her lips before fading. I'm not always good at conversations like that. The attorney cleared his throat, sensing the moment needed direction. We'll notify the board, he said. This matter is closed as far as the HOA is concerned. Karen nodded slowly, eyes unfocused, still processing. She turned toward her Lexus, movements slower now, more human than the crisp, clipped walk she usually showed. Before she opened the door, she paused. For what it's worth, she said without turning around, I genuinely thought I was right. I believed her. And somehow that made the entire situation feel stranger, heavier, more complicated than if she had been malicious. When she drove away, the clearing felt suddenly large and quiet, like the trees themselves were exhaling. Miles clapped a hand on my shoulder. Well, he said with a half-smile, that's about as clean a win as you're gonna get. Jenna's voice echoed in my memory. Prepare yourself. She won't back down gracefully. But watching Karen's retreating SUV, I didn't see someone plotting revenge or preparing another angle. I saw someone embarrassed, overwhelmed, and maybe for the first time realizing she'd built a whole narrative in her mind that didn't match reality. Whether that meant the conflict was truly over, I didn't know. But as the cabin settled behind me and the birds began to move through the branches again, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, Chapter 6 would finally be the part where things quieted down. In the weeks that followed, the cabin settled back into the quiet rhythm it had before the whole ordeal began, though it took me a while to trust that the peace was real and not just a pause before the next surprise. For the first few days, I half expected to find another laminated notice tied to the porch post or see Karen's white Lexus idling at the edge of the clearing. But the trail remained empty, the morning stayed still, and even the birds seemed to reclaim their usual chatter, as if nature itself had been waiting for people to stop arguing. I kept the survey packet inside the cabin where I could reach it easily, not because I thought I'd need it again, but because part of me still felt like the situation had unresolved edges. I'd go to sleep replaying the scene of Karen's face when the attorney confirmed the land was mine, how quickly her certainty had cracked, how quietly she'd spoken when she said she genuinely thought she was right. Sometimes, when I tried to be honest with myself, I realized that moment had stuck with me more than the arguments or the notices or even the police showing up. There was something sobering about watching someone realize their confidence had been built on assumptions and mistaken information, especially when they weren't a cartoon villain but a regular, flawed person who let pride guide them too far. The closure I expected didn't arrive as a dramatic apology or a grand gesture. Instead, it came one cold afternoon just as the first light dusting of snow began to settle on the pine needles. I was inside the cabin patching a loose floorboard when I heard footsteps on the trail. Slow ones, hesitant ones, not the purposeful march I'd come to associate with Karen. When I stepped outside, she was standing a few yards away with her hands tucked into the sleeves of her coat, hair tied back messily instead of its usual immaculate style. She looked smaller somehow, or maybe just less armored. I waited a moment, unsure whether to approach or let her speak first. She cleared her throat. "I wasn't sure if I should come," she said. Her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "But the board said I needed to address some things." I leaned against the porch railing, not as a defensive gesture but more to ground myself. "You don't have to if you don't want to." She shook her head. "I do." There was a pause while a gust of wind rustled through the branches above us, sending a fine sprinkle of snow down like powdered sugar. She brushed a few flakes off her coat before looking up at me again. "I've been thinking about everything," she began, choosing her words slowly. "I realize now that I let my role get bigger in my mind than it actually is. I kept assuming I needed to protect the neighborhood from problems that didn't really exist." "You care about your community," I said, trying to keep the tone neutral but not dismissive. "That's not a bad thing." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "Maybe not. But I went about it in all the wrong ways. When I thought you were building on our property, I felt responsible. Like if I didn't fix it, people would blame me. And when I convinced myself I was right, it got harder to imagine I might be wrong." She rubbed her hands together for warmth. I didn't realize how far I'd taken it until the attorney explained everything. It felt humiliating. I didn't say anything for a moment. I wanted to choose honesty without cruelty. "No one likes finding out they were wrong after doubling down," I said. "We've all done it in some form." She looked surprised by the statement, maybe expecting anger or resentment. "You're being kinder than I expected," she said, almost shyly. "I put you through a lot." "It was stressful," I admitted. "But it's over." Another long pause settled between us. She seemed to relax slightly, shoulders loosening under her coat. "I talked to the board," she said. "I told them the mistake was mine. They're going to revert the map to the original county boundaries, and they're removing my updated version from the records." I nodded. "That's good." She hesitated again, then exhaled a slow, fragile breath. "I know this may sound strange," she said, "but I wasn't trying to target you personally. You were just the thing I didn't understand." The cabin appeared so suddenly, and it felt like something slipped through the cracks of my responsibility. That phrasing caught me, because it wasn't maliciousness she was describing, it was fear. Fear of losing control, fear of failing, fear of not being seen as competent by the rest of the HOA. It didn't excuse what had happened, but it made the situation make more sense. People rarely escalate conflicts because they want chaos. They do it because something inside them feels threatened. "I appreciate you coming here," I said. "Most people wouldn't." She nodded, looking down at the snow beginning to accumulate in little mounds on top of her shoes. "I wanted to take down whatever's left of the notices," she added. "There were a few I posted along the trail. They shouldn't stay up." "I'll help if you want," I said. Her head snapped up, surprised. "You don't have to, it's fine," I said, grabbing my coat and stepping off the porch. "Might as well clean the slate properly." We walked the trail together quietly, collecting the laminated notices from branches and posts. The silence wasn't awkward, just new, two people existing in the same space without defensiveness. Every so often she'd point out a marker she'd placed, and I'd pull it down while she brushed snow off her sleeve. When we reached the last one, near the split in the trail where the subdivision path began, she paused for a long moment. "I really am sorry," she said finally. "It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't performed. It was just honest, and it landed in a way that felt grounding rather than emotional." "Thank you," I said simply. We parted ways there, her heading back toward the rows of houses partially visible through the trees, me walking back toward the clearing where the cabin stood waiting with smoke curling from the chimney. On the way I thought about how complicated people can be, how someone like Karen could be controlling, exhausting, even infuriating, and still not be the villain she seemed at first. Just someone who let her sense of responsibility warp into something rigid and misguided. The cabin came into view through the trees, the pond beyond it frozen near the edges, faint sunlight reflecting off the thin layer of ice. For the first time in months, it looked exactly the way it had when I first built it, quiet, undisturbed, unthreatened. When I stepped back inside and shut the door behind me, the warmth from the stove enveloped me, and I realized the tension in my shoulders had finally eased. Outside, the world was still cold and imperfect and full of people who misunderstood each other, but inside, for the moment, everything was calm. And that felt like the most realistic and earned ending I could have hoped for.